the failings of the squad management transition is there to see.
I get frustrated that people seem to think that everything we do on a daily basis suddenly should be dictated in the public domain. If everything we did was, quotes, transparent, even transfer activity, you'd never sign a player, you'd never do anything. When Leeds got relegated at the end of the following season, the blame game started. Did it go wrong? Yes. Could it have been avoided? Yes. I big-headedly say, had I stayed, I don't think it would have been relegated.
I'm not sure clubs have learned that much from those days.
Can you believe that 3 months ago you'd have asked one of the first questions you asked me, is Pep Guardiola unsackable?
The game generally is not in rude financial health. What we're going to do is we back this manager, come what may. It doesn't matter if he gets relegated, and we're just going to ignore all the noise. In an ideal world, that's what you do. If you wanted football to be a more rational business, managers would have longer.
Hello and welcome to How Football Works. I'm Olly Clink, making his debut on the show. I'm delighted to welcome Chief Executive at Preston North End and former Leeds Chairman Peter Ridsdale. And joining us once again is football finance expert and former financial advisor to Manchester City, Stefan Borson. Gentlemen, welcome to you. Let's start right away then with Manchester City, who of course lost the big one, the Manchester Derby at the weekend. That's one win in 11 now for the champions. 8 of those were defeats as well, their worst run since 2006. And Pep Guardiola, the invincible Pep Guardiola, said, "I am not good enough" after the game. So just what has gone wrong? Peter, I want to start with you on this. It's no secret what's going on behind the scenes at Manchester City with these charges hanging over them. You've been in these club environments before. How much might that be affecting what's going on the pitch?
Well, in my experience, very little, because what we have tried to do when I've been involved in issues where we've had incidents off the field is to make sure they're divorced completely from the training regime, the manager, the players. And I don't believe that the current run of form, these charges have been there for 2 or 3 years now, haven't they? It's been known. Obviously, the outcome hasn't. But I think that we're seeing a natural change of events at Man City where they've dominated for so long. A number of their players are getting older, they've had injuries. And teams have to rebuild. You just look at what Manchester United did with Alex Ferguson. I think everybody forgets he rebuilt 4 or 5 times during his tenure, and that's a challenge. Not every club can do that. And I think Man City are at a point where they probably need to do the same. But obviously, they've been so dominant for so long, it's a shock to the system.
It's almost incredible to be asking you this, given the run of form. But when you look at the situation at the moment with Pep and the run they've been on, as I mentioned there, 8 defeats in that run of 11 games, just 1 win as well. Is he unsackable? Is he unsackable as a manager? He's obviously elite, he's achieved so much with the club, but if a run like that continues, what kind of position does that give you in if you're on that board at Man City?
Well, look, the biggest single problem with football, and I hear this all the time after weekend games, you sit and listen to the radio and people are saying, should so-and-so be blamed for this? Should so-and-so be sacked? We're in a game where somebody wins, somebody loses. I know you draw now and again. But there's no other industry where when you wake up in the morning, what you've done in the week is in a league table. Most people go about their job and they think they're doing a good job or not. Football is measured by a league table, day in, day out. And then people then say, they slipped from top to 11th or 12th or wherever a team might be. You can't just go around sacking people. What you've got to do is stand one step back and say, what's caused what's happening at the moment? How do we change that? And you've got probably one of the most successful managers in all time in there. Now, if Pep were to turn around and say, I can't take it any further, I'm not sure what to do next, they'll have a conversation, I'm sure. But to sit here talking about sacking one of the most successful managers, what they should be doing is sit there and saying, right, what do you need to get it back on track? And that's what I would be doing.
Stefan Borson, not only are you a former financial advisor to the club, you are a Man City fan as well. It must be a bit of a shock to the system seeing all this. We've talked just there about Pep Guardiola, maybe what he needs to fix. But do you think that some of the mistakes have been actually outside of that and off the pitch and to do with maybe the transfer policy that the club has had?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly the failings of the squad management transition is there to see. I mean, if you look at the recent documentary that they did reviewing last season, they talked about the 2023 window as being a very disappointing and challenging window. And yet they went into the window that's just gone in the summer and bought one player in Savinho, a player that they bought from one of their sister clubs. Gundogan was bought back from Barcelona, but only on an opportunist basis. So it seems to me surprising that they would have a very disappointing 2023 summer period and then not remedy that either in the January of 2024 or in the summer of 2024. And they seem not to have done that. They clearly have created a squad that is unbalanced in terms of its age. And they've then been hit with an injury crisis and laid on top. Pep has often liked to work with a very thin squad, and it's really contrary to sort of public perception, but Pep likes to work with 20, 22 players as opposed to 25, 28. And clearly when you have a batch of injuries that City have had, and it's not just players who are missing games, but it's players who are not fit to play 90 minutes. So players coming back from injury, such as De Bruyne. So I think, clearly Pep is one of the best managers of all time. But ultimately, you have to have the tools on the pitch. And I think this season, the squad has been found wanting. And until that's remedied, I think the club and the team will continue to struggle, relatively speaking, on the pitch.
Peter, Stefan there talks about the issues, of course, with that ageing squad. You mentioned a rebuild as well. How do you go about doing that at a club the size of Manchester City?
Well, I'm going to say something now which people throw back at me, probably, but I think it should be easier at a club the size of Man City than it is the club the size of Preston North End, for example, because we've got only so much cash. Whereas Man City have got not just the club itself, but they've got this global football network, which I assume is part and parcel of them wanting to have young players out playing elsewhere or getting experience elsewhere. And of course, they do have cash. I think it's interesting that Cheeky's going as well, who's the sporting director this summer, and whether or not that change over has affected what's happened or not, I don't know. What I do believe is absolutely right is it would appear to me that some of the expected rebuilding that you would see end of 23, 24 now hasn't taken place. And I think the task is going to be greater than perhaps it should have been.
You mentioned there that Cheeky Begiristain is going, the sporting director. Does that highlight just how important that role is in current football today? Well,
we don't have one at Preston. It's partly the way we structure things, but a lot of clubs do now. I think if you've got one, they clearly need to be at the forefront of that planning process. In some clubs like ours, we have a manager who's part of that process and we work very closely with him, but he still does the same job. He just, one day he's training them and picking the team, and the other time there's a recruitment meeting, he's talking about what players he'd like to bring in. But the sporting director's role isn't about today. It's about the next transfer window and the next transfer window and planning for the future. And I assume that whether it be at Man City or elsewhere, you just see Manchester United hire one and lose one very quickly, but they've gone into that role for the first time, whereas when they had Alex Ferguson, he did it all himself. So the sporting director's role is crucial, but the relationship between the sporting director and the head coach or the manager is equally crucial, because unless they're like-minded in who they want and when they want them, it's not going to work, it's not going to gel. Clearly, Cheeky and Pep had that relationship, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward.
It is indeed. Staying with Manchester City, and of course, earlier this month, the hearing into the club's alleged 115 charges finally concluding, and the eagle-eyed Stefan Borson, of course, noticed the club has deleted references to the charges in going concern of its official account. Stefan, could you just take us through what you mean by this and what it means for Manchester City?
So it could be something, it could be nothing, but the club put out its annual accounts that have to go through an audit process. They put those out last week. And if you were to do a side-by-side comparison between the 22-23 accounts and the 23-24 accounts, you'll see that two references to the charges have been removed, one from the going concern statement and one from a section headed Other Commitments, there is still reference to the charges within the risks and uncertainty section. So it's not as if they've been removed completely from the set of accounts. But I think it's notable that having gone through an audit process during the hearing for the charges, because the audit process would have started at the year end, 30th of June, and run all the way through to the 8th of October. And we know the hearing itself started in early September. So we know that the audit process will have been done in the backdrop of the charges. I think it is notable, although not definitive, that reference to the charges have been removed from the going concern statement. And in the going concern statement, you would have expected to see those matters that have a material uncertainty in terms of the future of the club referenced, as they were in 22-23. And clearly, therefore, the deletion of that signifies at least possibly a change of approach from the auditors in respect of that particular matter. And it could be just because the club has got a better steer for the ultimate outcome, whether certain things maybe have fallen away in the hearing, or certain things they don't see as major risks. Or it may be that the club has just given them the level of certainty that even in a worst case scenario, there isn't an issue with going concern. So I wouldn't read too much into it, but likewise, I do think it's notable when you see differences of this nature between two sets of accounts that are produced by the same auditor and the same management team.
If we are reading into it, is this a positive for Manchester City?
I think it can only be a positive. At worst, it's neutral, but at best, it signifies something within the audit process that gave the auditors and the management team, because the management team ultimately responsible for, and the directors ultimately responsible for the financial statements, but effectively gave the auditors more comfort that they were happy to take it out of the going concern as part of the accounts. But as I say, at worst neutral, at best it could be positive. But I think more for me, just notable, and you sort of raise the question: what has gone on during the discussions around the audit committee to see them remove that from the going concern statement?
Peter, obviously it's a number of cases that will roll on and on. Do you feel that it should be public? There's been a few calls that this, because of the interest in it, should have been made more public. What's your view on that?
I get frustrated that people seem to think that everything we do on a daily basis suddenly should be dictated in the public domain, and no other business is subjected to that. And who's asking the question, and what right do they have to ask the question? I think it's right and proper that there's due legal process taking place. It's taking place in an appropriate forum, as far as I'm concerned, and they will publish the results once the decisions are taken. But if everything we did was, quote, transparent, even transfer activity, you'd never sign a player, you'd never do anything, because people would be commenting and second guessing, and the media would have a field day. So no, I think that the process that's taking place has been done in the right way, the right manner, the right forum, and ultimately what will be will be.
Stefan, how about you? Where do you sit on the case of it being a more private than usual?
Well, usual in a business context. I mean, let's be clear that the clubs and the Premier League have all agreed that any of these sorts of cases will be held in private. So, and that is not untypical in private arbitration in a commercial sense. And football is a business at the end of the day. Now, clearly, it has huge public interest, and therefore people point to wanting a little bit more in the public domain in the way that it would be if it was a high court dispute. That said, there are clearly a lot of sensitivities around the case. The allegations are very serious, and it's an incredibly long case. And it doesn't really mean, even if this was a public hearing, it doesn't mean that we would get a fair representation of what went on over every day of a 12-week hearing. I suspect that you would still get some relatively partial reporting of it, and it would be difficult. I think, as Peter says, the process there is a very detailed process of a 12-week hearing, which is incredibly in depth in terms of the work that's gone on to investigate the the allegations, and then we will get a very detailed and public decision from that tribunal, and that will go into huge amounts of detail, probably 400-500 pages long, and then I don't think people will be able to complain about transparency. The one thing that I do think is really lacking in the process is a timetable. And I think it would have been in everybody's interest around the table to communicate to the outside world, including the fans, when they can expect a decision. Because the situation that we have at the moment is that any day now, from probably early January all the way through to perhaps the end of the season, at any time, this very, very significant decision could drop that could change the future of the Premier League. It could happen at any time. And I think it's unfair, really, for particularly Manchester City fans, but also fans overall, that it could happen at any point. It's also unfair on those employees of Manchester City who could be affected through no fault of their own by a decision that happens here. And it can just come out of the blue. And clearly, if the decision goes the wrong way for Manchester City, the consequences will be very, very severe and could well end up with people, unfortunately, actually losing their jobs, because that's the sort of impact that this decision could have. So I do think it would be sensible for there to be an agreed timetable, but clearly we're not in that world, and the parties haven't gone down that process, and therefore we just wait. But I think in terms of letting the public have access to the hearing itself, I don't think that was necessary, and we will get good transparency. But I think timetable was something to me that was uncontroversial on either side, and therefore should have been shared with the outside world.
I think Stefan makes a good point there, that it's actually for the planning of clubs as well. One of the things we love doing on this show is hearing from those directly involved within the game. And Peter, you probably have had one of the most interesting careers of any of our guests so far. No offence, Stefan, of course. You've worked with a number of clubs, but let's start with the club that everyone watching will be wanting to hear about. That is, of course, Leeds United. For those who don't know, just talk us through your story with the club.
I was born in Leeds, supporter of the club from being 7 years old. I sponsored the Leeds United through Top Man. I was chief executive of Top Man, and we put Top Man on the shirts. They invited me to join the board on the back of that in 1987. And then in 1997, they asked me to take over as chairman, which I did until 31st of March 2003. There were all sorts of things going in internally, not so much to do with finances as people then, after the fact, thought it was. There were all sorts of issues going on. I agreed to step down. Initially, I was going to be a non-exec director, but a lot of people approached me to do other things in football, so I gave that up fairly quickly. And then when Leeds got relegated at the end of the following season, the blame game started. And you would think it was a one-man show.
There are, of course, the heady days, as you mentioned, with the Champions League runs and finishing in the top five during your time there. You then mentioned the relegation that came after you had left. Do you feel that you took too much of the blame for what went wrong with Leeds?
Look, Leeds United was a public limited company. It was listed on the stock exchange, and I was chairman of the board, and I had two very heavyweight non-exec directors who I chose from the city. And obviously I had some colleagues who were also on the board. Every single decision that was taken by the board. We reported, as every public company does, twice a year to shareholders, not just by the stock exchange announcements, but by visiting the key shareholders. And they were totally supportive of the direction the club was taking while I was the chairman. Did we do things wrong? Yeah, of course, because we're human beings. Did we do a lot of things right? Yes, and I think that's never really talked about. I was chairman for 5 full seasons. We were never outside of the top 5 of the Premier League, and we weren't in the top 5 when I took over as chairman. In addition to top 5 of the Premier League, I was semi-final of the UEFA Cup and semi-final of the Champions League. Did we borrow at that time money to try and compete? Yes, we did. Was that on a secured 25-year basis? Yes, it was. Did the shareholders approve it? Yes, they did. But once you get relegated, it was financial disaster because it didn't have a single beneficial owner like a lot of clubs that have now who've got deep pockets. And in those days, there were no parachute payments, but I wasn't there. So, look, do I take the blame? I don't take all the blame. Do I take responsibility for things we got wrong? Of course, because ultimately the buck stops with the chairman. I think a lot of things that have been said have been unfair. I think some of it being without the facts. And I think
Which
some of it's been trying to blame.
Do you think have been unfair?
People talk about financial meltdown, but at the time that I left, we had spent a lot of money, but we'd also recouped a lot of money. You know, we bought Rio Ferdinand for 18 million, just sold him in 2002 for 30 million to Manchester United. We had a lot of assets. We just had our accounts valued, where we had our playing squad. In today's numbers, it doesn't sound a lot of money, but over £200 million. I think the day I left, we published the accounts and we had debt of 78 million, of which of over 60 million was on a 25-year mortgage. So, look, did it go wrong? Yes. Could it have been avoided? Yes. I big-headedly say, had I stayed, I don't think we'd have been relegated. I think my track record would demonstrate that, both there and since. I've never been relegated whilst in control of a football club. But did we get some things wrong? Of course we did. I mean, you know, that's life, and we're human beings. But it wasn't a one-man show.
You place a lot of that downfall on that relegation. You've just said there that you don't think you'd have been relegated if you'd stayed in charge. Do you think, though, that that relegation came about because of some of the mistakes that were made during your time in charge at Leeds?
Well, I left 23 full internationals when I left the club on the 31st of March. And when you go through that team, I don't know how it got relegated. You know, you've got Mark Viduka, you've got Alan Smith, you've got Nigel Martin, you know, you've got Paul Robinson, you've got James Milner, Aaron Lennon, Jason Wilcox. You just go through that team, and Harry Kewell. You know, how did that team get relegated? I don't know. I wasn't there. In my view, the tipping point was relegation. Now, did we invest? Yes. Should we have done? Who knows? Everybody backed us at the time, including the shareholders. Supporters definitely did. So did it go into a financial meltdown some 2 years later? Yes. It went, I think under Ken Bates, probably 4 or 5 years after I left. He put it into admin, took it out, but not while I was there. But nobody was saying anything when we were top 5 and Champions League semi-final. The shareholders weren't saying anything. The board weren't saying anything. But I would be crazy to sit here and say we didn't get some things wrong, because of course we did. But in my opinion, the tipping point was relegation, no parachute payments, and if I did make a mistake, we didn't have any relegation clauses because we'd never been out the top 5. And when you're signing players like Rio and Robbie Fowler and Robbie Keane, and other clubs want them, you're not going to say, oh, by the way, if we get relegated, this is what happens to your pay, because they'll look at you and say, well, if you think you're going to get relegated, we're not going to join you. So, look, I look back, we had a lot of very good times while I was on the board. We got promoted from the second tier as champions. We won the top league in 1992 when I was on the board. The year before the Premier League, we had a great 5 years I was chairman. But yeah, it went into meltdown, and I'd been part of the process.
Of course, like you said, you know, you're a Leeds lad yourself. You grew up there. You watched the team growing up, and there's sections of that Leeds support who obviously associate you with that meltdown and with everything like that. It must be difficult. Would you swap the success that you had with that, if it meant that they didn't feel like that towards you and your time at the club?
No, because I think that would be selfish. I think the success, everybody who lived through the success, I still meet people who went to Champions League games. There were some people I met in the away games who were there with the little lads, and they were saying, Peter, I'm not paying my rent this month because I want to bring my son to Real Madrid or to Barcelona or whatever, because I may never see it again. And that changed their lives. So for me to say the grief I get, I'd swap it for what happened to Leeds United would be so selfish. The grief's been horrific, but to be honest, it comes with the territory. And if you're not prepared to put up with it, don't take the job in the first place. Did I anticipate the grief? No, because I didn't think it was going to go wrong. Has it been tough? Yeah, horrific. More so my children than me, to be honest. It's affected them. They've been all sorts of issues through school, etc. Because
does it still affect them now?
Well, they're older, so you'd hope not. Although my eldest daughter got married recently, and I gave a speech at the wedding saying I hadn't appreciated the psychological damage it had done to them, given what happened when they were going through school, because I was so wrapped up in everything, I didn't see it. And that was disastrous on my part. I mean, it's shocking for me not to see that in my own children. And that was because of mistakes I'd made, not mistakes they'd made. But the thing that I find quite interesting is I haven't been at Leeds since 2003, and I get more grief from under 25s than over 25s. The people who saw the games, who were there at the time, who've seen what's happened to Leeds, both when I was there and since then, still can compartmentalise the successful bits, albeit they're still potentially critical of the bad bits. The younger generation who didn't have the benefit of what happened just believe that I'm the bad guy, and the abuse I get from them is horrific.
What kind of abuse are you talking about?
I've been threatened on trains, in the street, at games, physical violence. You know, just some of the stuff is just horrific. But you just wonder what's going through the minds. I was on a train going to the cup final with my wife, and a lad came over. He'd had a bit too much to drink, and he came up and started ranting, stuck his head in my face, and he's effing and blinding. My wife's sitting there and accusing me of the person who ruined his football club. And this is this summer. And I said to him, and he was so abusive, and I said to him, how old are you? He said, I'm 19. I said, well, I haven't been at Leeds for 21 years. And he said, but you're the man who did it. Well, I might be, I might not be, but he doesn't know.
Because he didn't experience those days and the time when you were at the club. It's interesting as well, Peter, because you must have been one of the first in both the good days and the bad days that was thrust into the spotlight as someone who was, you know, running the football club. How do you feel then when you now see sporting directors, owners, chairmen who are so in the public eye now, receiving similar kinds of abuse? Do you sympathise with them?
Of course. Look, it's a challenge. And look, I made a number of mistakes personally in terms of making myself accessible. I'm sitting here talking to you today, and I haven't done very much recently. But I went from trying hard to be open and honest and talk to people if they asked, and a lot of people asked. I was on the board of the FA at the time. We were very successful. And then people turned around, threw it back in my face and said, publicity Pete. Well, I wasn't seeking it. I was asked, and probably I did it too often. We had two very high-profile issues, which thrust me into the spotlight because we were a public company. We had two supporters murdered in Galatasaray, and I decided to take the lead because I thought that was what a chairman of a public company did. And we had an issue with Jonathan Woodgate and Lee Boyer in a 2-year court case, which again, I took the lead on behalf of the club. It's going back to the Man City thing. Where does it affect the players? I tried to take it away from the players and take responsibility for managing that process and leave the team to get on with their job. But of course, by definition, it put me in the public spotlight. So when things start going wrong, you're left there to be, it's a classic case in this country. We're happy to put people on a pedestal, but we kick the pedestal away as soon as we can, don't we? And it's a lesson I've learnt. I got badly hurt by learning the lesson, and I shouldn't have been surprised. I was very naive. So now I try, in the main, apart from days like today, to keep my head down and just get on with the job.
Stefan, from a financial point of view, when you look at Peter's time at Leeds and that spell for Leeds United, what do you feel that clubs have learnt from what happened at the club at the time, and what do you make of the whole situation?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure the clubs have learnt that much from those days. If you look at the quality of investor that's coming into the game and the risks that are taken in terms of the pursuit of success on the field, I think that's common even today. And as Peter said, the spending was all approved by everybody around the table, all the board, all of the investors, all of the fans, and that's normal. That's what's happening at the moment with a number of clubs in the Premier League. But of course, if it goes wrong, then everybody looks for somebody to blame. So I think football is a fairly unique asset in terms of how people approach the situation. I think, as Peter said earlier, you've got this measure, like a public company in some ways, because a public company has a share price every day. But in terms of the performance of the underlying business, you see that every week in the league table, or every day now that we play football on every single day. So there's this barometer, and it breeds a need for management teams to take action, to spend money that they don't necessarily have, or maybe push that risk level maybe a little bit too high. And sometimes, unfortunately, it goes wrong. I think, as Peter said again, the quality of players that they had on the field at that time made the worst case scenario very unlikely. But when it does happen, and when you start to have that situation in the public domain where you have that spiral, and I think from a Leeds perspective, they had a perfect storm in many ways. You had controversial issues, quite high profile on the field, listed, so you had the stock market requirements, and it made good copy. And unfortunately, crisis situations tend to feed themselves, and that sort of fire that's lit by maybe a small thing going wrong can very quickly become a major issue, and ultimately it can end in relegation, as Peter said. And then once you have that relegation, and it will apply to many clubs in the Premier League, the idea that you can go around telling people to have relegation clauses if you're a top 6 or top 8 club, it's just not possible. So the risks are there for a lot of clubs, and when it happens, there's almost no way around it, because especially in days before parachute payments, if you have 100 million quid going out on season to season, and you're locked in with a wage bill that's very high, and other operating costs that are also similarly high, there's almost no solution to it aside from having somebody put their hand in their pocket in terms of putting some equity into the club. And if you don't have that, then you're in severe trouble. So, unfortunately, I do think that a number of clubs will continue to see those sorts of risks going forward. They are a consequence of risk-taking at the top of the game, and unfortunately the quite unusual nature of sport and the pressure that fans put on it.
Peter, ironically, it was.
Can I just
go?
Just want to say one thing, because I agree with everything that's just been said. Can you believe that 3 months ago you'd have asked one of the first questions you asked me, is Pep Guardiola unsackable? And that, to me, just shows, there's one of the most successful managers. You're asking us what happens if it goes wrong, and yet today you're asking me about Pep. And that's the business we're in. Within a 3-month period, you can go from he's lauded, he might leave at the end of the season, give him a new contract, and then you're asking a question about, is he sackable or unsackable? And that's the industry we face. And it's a weird situation where you've got, I don't like calling supporters customers, but you've got people who are supporters who are desperate for you to be successful. And their desperation is spend, spend, spend. Now, our job is to say we can't wherever we can't. But that pressure from both sides, success on the one hand and people demanding success and the investment. Somebody asked me the other day, how much would it cost to get Preston promoted? And I said, I have no idea, because I'm not operating in a vacuum. The owners could give me another 5 million, 10 million. It doesn't guarantee anything, because I've got 23 other teams trying to outdo me every week. So there isn't a solution. You do your best, you do what you think is right, you try and put the finances together, you try and do all the right things, but the dynamics of the basis of the business you're in, there's no guaranteed success.
Not at all. Now, of course, Peter, you've worked within the game for nearly 30 years with Leeds, as we've mentioned, Barnsley, Cardiff, Plymouth and Preston since 2011. In your eyes, how has football changed even since, we're talking, 13 years ago?
Well, I think it's changed radically, and in fact, we've just touched on the subject there, because one of the things that happened when I was first in football is, in the main, the ownership model, there's the odd PLC, Manchester United, Leeds, etc. But in the main, the ownership model was the local business person done good. And, the parameters of spend were prescribed. We've now got either billionaires or we've got financial institutions who have changed the outlook completely. So if you actually look at what top players were earning 20 years ago and you look at what top players are earning now, they're still the same players, still the same quality, and yet their wages are 10 times probably what they were. And the financial risk, I think, is even greater today than it's ever been. I mean, we talked earlier about Man City's going concern commentary in their accounts. If you actually go through just about every football club in the country and look at going concern on any normal business basis, hardly any of them would pass. the going concern is subject to the owner putting the money in or this happening or whatever. But on a classic business model basis, I think half of the teams in the top 4 divisions are bust, probably, on a normal business model. So it's changed radically. And I think at some point, I don't know when that is, you might see something spectacularly happen.
Really? Did you go along with that, Stefan? Do you see something spectacular happen, as Peter puts it there, in the future? Is it sustainable?
Well, you've got very deep pockets. So ultimately, I think very few of these clubs are at risk because they're owned by institutions or billionaires who will put their hand in their pocket in a worst-case scenario and will support the clubs. But that doesn't mean that it's going to happen every time for forever. So I think as it is now, there is clearly a lot of risk at the top of the game. If a club had a Leeds type situation, these wage bills at the top of the table are not sustainable in the Championship. So that therefore brings risk. But it then comes back to what we just said, which is, are the owners of these clubs prepared to put their hand in their pocket and subsidise those clubs in that period? And most of them would be, because they know that if they don't, then their existing equity is going to be wiped out. So there's risk. I mean, I think it's as Peter just said. The game generally is not in rude financial health, and that's not just in England. That's across Europe. The clubs are far too. There's nowhere near enough profit being made, and the cost bases of these clubs are too high, and the pressures that they're put on by fans is very hard to control, and very few clubs have ever really managed to do it. We even look at, again, going back to what we talked about in terms of City. We should remember that during the period that we just talked about, where we're arguably saying that they haven't invested substantially enough in the team. They won the treble 2 seasons ago. They won the league last season, and their wage bill for last season was £412 million. So, and this is a club we're saying is just not investing enough. And that, is the situation in a nutshell. The demands in this game are such that even very rational business decisions can be put under pressure by the competition of sport.
And Peter, just in terms of your time at Preston as well, how difficult is it for clubs such as Preston to make their way up into the Premier League, given that in recent years, with obviously a couple of exceptions, we've seen so many of the clubs yo-yoing up and down, able to spend more than some of the clubs in the Championship? Does it make a glass ceiling for clubs like Preston?
Definitely for clubs like Preston. And I think the thing that's happened over the last few years is the incidence of at least 2 of the teams that came down going back up again is getting greater. If you look at the parachute payment model, which I understand why it was there, but they're going up every year, way above what the media distribution rights are for the rest of the Championship. So it's getting harder to compete. And the danger is you then spend more than you can really afford to try and compete and you fail. What is also equally disturbing in my view is that those who go up don't seem able to compete either. So if you take last year, Southampton had, I think, the second highest wage bill in the Championship. They got promoted, they won the player final. And they've got, is it 6 points? I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I think 6 points in the Premier League this year. So if they can't compete, what chance do clubs like Preston have, who've got, I think, got the 23rd turnover in the division. We've got the 20th or 21st wage bill at the moment in the division. And we've finished lowest 14th, and between 7th and 14th since we got promoted in 2015. And our supporters, understandably, are frustrated and say it's not good enough. But on what measure is it not good enough? I think the biggest single issue we face is if you put the Premier League and the Football League back together again, and I was around in '92 when the Premier League was formed, the distribution of money through the leagues will be different to what it is today. And I'm not just focusing on parachute payments per se, but what I'm saying is that you wouldn't have a step change if it was one ownership between or league structure between the Premier League and League Two, the 20th team in the Premier League wouldn't necessarily get 100 million and then another 56 and another 46, and the 21st team get 11 million, which is what the distribution is commonly across the Championship.
Do you think we should go back to that then?
So I think the only way of solving it, and I've said this at the FL meeting, so I'm not saying anything today to you that I haven't said internally, the simplest solution, but not one that's necessarily going to get a lot of traction, is if you put it back together and you looked at it again and said, how would you distribute the money in the game? The current distribution model would be changed, in my view. I'm not saying the Premier League shouldn't get a lot more than the Championship, of course they should. But I don't think you'd have that step change down that you've got now, which is what we call the cliff edge. And I then think more teams would be able to compete.
So for our final section, we want to end the show today with a question. Is there ever a good time to sack your manager? Both Gary O'Neill and then Russell Martin faced the axe this weekend with Wolves 5 points from safety and Southampton rock bottom of the Premier League, 9 points adrift. So does it work? Before this season, teams had sacked managers 91 times while in the relegation zone, and 40% of those teams stayed up. Stefan, what's your take on that data? For you, does it feel that this is something that works?
Well, we know that the psychology on the pitch is so important. So if you make changes that can instill some confidence, even if it's short term, that can get you 3, 6, 9, 12 points, it is going to make a difference. And so that's what attracts these management changes. I mean, what I haven't looked at is what are the stats in terms of how often or how long that change of manager that you just brought in then lasts for. You know, so they may have that immediate impact. You may stay in the league that you're in, or you may get some more points on a short-term basis. But in a medium-term basis, are those managers still there in 3 years? I suspect not. So, look, I can understand why teams do it, and you can see in the data that it does have an impact and it does work. But I think if you look at the stuff that we've just talked about from a business perspective, the really rational thing to do, and it's not done very often, but the really rational thing to do would be to ignore all of the noise, to ignore all of the short-term results, to ignore the last-minute winner against Ipswich and the 5-0 defeat at home by Spurs, and to say, what we're going to do is we back this manager, come what may, and we're going to give him 3 years, and it doesn't matter if he gets relegated, and we're just going to ignore all the noise, because we've got a long-term strategy. In an ideal world, that's what you do. But unfortunately, where you have the prize that's at stake here, the cost of relegation and the noise from the supporters, it's very, very hard to maintain that completely rational business strategic decision. And so it's both understandable, but also slightly disappointing, I guess, from a business perspective, that you can't just ignore the noise and strategically focus on backing a particular manager, even if they have a poor season.
Peter, Ryan Lowe left Preston after one game this season. You then had a process to choose the next manager. Am I right in saying it was 55 applicants I think you went through before choosing Paul Heckingbottom? What were the most important things for you when hiring a new manager?
Well, one of the things that I don't think clubs do often enough is look at the cultural fit. If you go out and hire any other executive in your business, you look at how they'll fit in, what the culture is where they were, what the culture is where you are, and do they fit into that culture? What football tends to do is go and pluck somebody who's done well there or whatever, without necessarily taking into account what I think is one of the most important. So when we looked at Paul and we talked to Paul and we looked at the other candidates, first of all, he'd taken a team from the Championship to the Premier League. He'd also been promoted with Barnsley, so he got 2 promotions on his CV. He's a good coach. And I sometimes worry that you hire a manager and the first thing he does is say he doesn't like the players. Well, in what other business do you just get rid of all your investment and your capital expenditure and just replace it because the person you brought in doesn't like what you bought in the first place? If there really are good coaches, part of the job is to make the players better or perform better. Of course, you'll top up the squad as and when you can, but you can't have a revolution. And I do also believe in managers have got to have time. And we had Simon Grayson for 5 years, then he decided to go to Sunderland. We had Alex Neil for 4 years, and in the end that went wrong coming out of COVID for all sorts of reasons, but 4 years is a long time. And Ryan had been with us 2.5 years. And in fact, and again, we've just talked about it, last Christmas we got beat at Swansea just before the Christmas programme. And the following day, the owner and I went to the canteen at the training ground, and we got all the players together and said, right, we're not going to sack the manager, so you better sort yourselves out. And we went on a run which was unbelievable. To the last 5 games, we ended up finishing 10th in the league. We went this remarkable run. And I think the players were getting more nervous at the outside noise, assumed that the manager was potentially going to get sacked. And we just said, he ain't going to get sacked. Whether you like it or not, he's here to the end of the season, so you better do something about it. And whatever happened, and I know it sounds easy now, but whatever happened, it worked.
I mentioned those managers in the Premier League who have lost their jobs now in Gary O'Neill and Russell Martin. If you were in charge of those clubs at this given time, is that the same action you would have taken?
Look, I can't speak for Wolves or Southampton. All I can say is in any job, whether it's a manager or whether it be anybody working for you, you work very hard to support them. You work very hard to give them the tools to do the job. But sometimes, and I think that's probably happened this week, there comes a time when both of you understand that the only way to take the pressure off everybody is to make a change. And when that point arrives, I've always believed you know. And when you know, you need to do it.
Stefan, just a final word from you. Do you think that there's too much of a hire and fire culture for football managers? Peter's there's talked about, for the majority of his spell at Preston, giving a lot of managers time. Would you want to see a bit more of that, especially in the Premier League?
Well, look, I think if you wanted football to be a more rational business, managers would have longer. I mean, there's no question. The tenure of the lead coach in the Premier League, across the game, is too short.
Stefan, thank you very much indeed. Peter, thank you very much for your time as well. As we are recording, by the way, Vitor Pereira has signed an 18-month contract at Wolves as well. Just very quickly, Peter, on that, just before I let you go, do you feel that is an interesting appointment, isn't it? Because he's had a career with a bit of success, but no Premier League experience. Is that a bit of a risk from Wolves?
Well, a lot of clubs seem to be bringing people in from overseas without any Premier League experience, so they obviously see something. Some of them work, some of them don't. I think in this case, he's had quite a number of jobs from what I remember. Look, they know their business, they understand what they're looking for, it's up to them, and I wish them all the best.
Well, that's it from us this week. Please remember to like this and subscribe to talkSPORT on YouTube, or you can keep up to date and follow the show on Spotify, where you can both watch and listen to all our episodes. Thank you very much for your company, and thanks to our panellists Peter Ridsdale and Stefan Borson. See you next time.